Okay, welcome to our second lecture from People, Places, and Culture. Going to talk a little bit about development theories and modern capitalism and kind of what they mean as a continuation of our discussion of states. The slides were designed to accompany the book People, Places, and Culture. I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So, when we're talking about the construction of the world capitalist economy, um, we have to remember not just what's going on now, but really what's happened historically. And one of the most important, one of the most powerful impacts of colonialism is this construction of a global order that's characterized by huge differences in economic and political power between countries. Okay, so when we're talking about those differences, what we really mean is it's like the difference between, say, the United States and a country like South Sudan, where the United States has a huge economy, we've got political power all over the world, we've got power to spare really in a lot of ways, and then South Sudan that's very, very poor, that does not have a lot of power in the world, arguably doesn't even have a lot of power in its own region, um, just because of the way things have worked out. And we trace that back to colonialism and that concentration of wealth that colonialism brings to Europe initially, and then also to parts of the world that were later dominated by European settlers. So when we say that, really what we're talking about are places like the United States, we're talking about Canada, we're talking about Australia. Okay, these are areas that are dominated by European settlers. Okay. And the legacy of colonialism is the heart of really a highly uh, uneven global distribution of power that we see even until today, and I already kind of touched on that a few seconds ago. Um, so when we're talking about the capitalist world economy, we have to keep in mind, first of all, that there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but more broadly, what social scientists seek, and when we say social scientists, we're talking about um, people who study people as a form of science, really, rather than people who study, say, the natural world. Okay, so social scientists different from natural scientists, I guess would be another way to think about it. And what social scientists seek to do is try and figure out how each dot fits into the whole. Okay, so each dot, like if you're an art person and you've done pointillism, right, how each individual dot in a pointillist picture fits into the whole picture. Uh, when we're talking about politics and political science, those dots are the countries. So how does each country fit into the whole? We're talking about world systems theory, right? The people who are proponents of it, who argue for it, they say that we need to view the world as much more than just simply the sum total of the world states. Okay, so the world is more than the sum of its parts. Um, there's three basic ideas behind world systems theory. Okay, and some of these we've discussed, and some of these we haven't discussed as much. As Wallerstein defines them, and remember, he's the primary theorist that we talk about when we talk about world systems theory. Okay, and we're going to talk about each of these in turn. They're each going to get their own slide. So, basic tenet number one: that there is a world economy with one market, and that there's a global division of labor. Okay, so within that world economy, okay, we see a lot of capitalism, and capitalism in the world economy, really what we're talking about is individuals, corporations, and states that produce goods and services that are exchanged for profit. In other words, each side gets what they want. Okay. And then this also relies on this idea of commodification. Okay. And commodification is the idea of placing a price on a good, service, or idea so that we can then buy, sell, or trade that item. And it's one of those underlying ideas of capitalism. Obviously, you can't exchange goods or services for profit if you haven't first put some kind of a price on it. So whether we're bartering, and so the price of my 5 apples is your 6 bananas, right? That's still a price. Or whether what we're doing is using what's really a modified form of bartering, which is what you and I are used to, which is to say, I give you $2 and you give me a pen, right? And then you can go ahead and turn around and use that $2 maybe to buy a couple of candy bars or something like that. Okay, so in the developed world, that's the way capitalism works. We use money as a medium of exchange because it's much easier than figuring out 900 different prices for a given item, right? So maybe my 5 apples are worth your 6 bananas, but 4 tires from my friend Frank, right? Um, each individual thing I'm trying to trade for is going to have a separate price, and that's why we need this commodification idea. 2, okay, although the world has multiple states, so there's a variety of countries, almost everything takes place within that broader context of the world economy. So in other words, even though there's things that are going on within individual countries, what we need to look at is the big picture and say, how does that fit into what's going on in the world itself? Okay. And colonialism plays a major role in establishing and really facilitating this system as it's getting off the ground because it exports that idea of the European state. Okay, and again, state, every time you hear it, I want you to think country because that's really what political scientists are meaning when they talk about states. Okay, so we take that European state idea, that country idea, and it helps create the construction of this interdependent global economy, right? So European countries develop colonies all over the world, but it's a two-way system. They're taking things out of the colonies and they're selling things to the colonies. So really it's a cycle, and it's what creates this interdependent global economy. 3, okay, and this is the last major tenet of world systems theory, is that the world economy has a 3-tier structure. Okay, the core countries are where we find higher levels of education, higher salaries, more technology, better development, lower birth rates. We could go on. Okay, periphery, which is kind of the opposite of core, right? So these are processes that are associated with a more marginal position in the world economy, where we have lower levels of education, lower salaries, assuming salaries are even paid at all. Technology is not as well spread. Birth rates are higher. Governments are worse. We could go on and on and on. And then we've also got this semi-periphery, and semi-periphery kind of falls in the middle. It's places where core and periphery processes are both occurring. So in other words, where they're able to exploit some countries, right, for labor is generally speaking a big one these days that countries are exploited for, or resources. Resources are another big one. But also where there's some periphery processes occurring. In other words, they're also being exploited when they're being exploited by core countries. Okay, and so it's kind of this middle level where they're not quite well off, but they're definitely not poor. They're kind of in the middle there. So when we talk about world systems theory, it's not all roses, right? So there are some major concerns and some things that you really need to remember as you're trying to use it as a way to analyze the world. One is that it places a very, very heavy emphasis on economic factors and the role of economics in political development, okay? To the extent that economic factors are the driver in political development to a large degree. And 2 is that while it does look at the big picture, it's very state-centric. Okay, so when we talk about it being state-centric, what it means is it doesn't account for other forms of politics or political development or political units. Okay, so it's very much focused on using the country as the method of analysis or the level of analysis. Okay, and last but not least, and this is really an important one, is that it doesn't account for how places move from one category to another. In other words, it doesn't try to explain how countries that used to be periphery are now semi-periphery, right? Or countries that used to be semi-periphery are now core. So it doesn't explain how you can move from one category to another, or how a place that used to be a core country could move into and then be a semi-periphery country. So it doesn't really try to explain that. And that's an important thing to try and remember. When we're talking about world systems theory and political power, things to remember is that each state is theoretically sovereign, and remember, sovereign means that they have control over their political, economic control over their territory, but not all states have the same ability to influence others or achieve their political goals. And we talked about this with the first slide. We talked about the US wielding a lot more power politically, right? If the US at the end of the day were to go into a country and say, you will do this or we will bomb you, we have a lot more ability to say, yes, you're going to do this. Or if we say we get mad at a country and we decide we're just going to place sanctions on them, that's got a lot more sway or a lot more influence than if, say, Malawi decides to do it. Okay. Um, World systems theory does, though, one of the things it does very well is it helps explain how Europe politically reorganized the world during colonialism. And that is an important thing to remember. Um, and the idea of the nation state is one of those things that continues to endure. So even though there's many problems and a lack of simple solutions to, all right, sorry about the interruption. So regardless of there's a lot of problems and a lack of simple solutions to national conflicts and state conflicts. And remember, those are not the same things. Um, the European territorial state idea, where again we've got a state with a defined territory, became the world model, and it continues to and still shapes the political organization of space worldwide. As a matter of fact, it's the definitive model for shaping political organization of space worldwide. So let me go ahead and kind of wrap this up now that we've had a few interruptions and things. Really the big part of this lecture is we've been talking about world systems theory and the development of the modern capitalist state. So what we've been looking at is the major tenets of world systems theory, right? That there is a single global economy, that nation states are the primary players in that, that it's split into three levels, right? Core, periphery, semi-periphery. Um, and that it helps explain how the colonial system really reshaped the political world. We've also talked about some of the criticisms of world systems theory, that it doesn't account for movement from one level to another, that it heavily emphasizes the role of the state, for example, and there's another one that I'm totally drawing a blank on. And we ended up by talking about world systems theory and political power and how not all states are created equal in terms of their influence and their ability to achieve political goals, and ended with a little bit of talk about nation states and really how they continue to influence what goes on in the world today. So if you have any questions, I'd be delighted to take them. Please feel free to just come see me during class, and I will see you the next time we meet.